Hey dreamers, tonight we're stepping into one of mythology's most surprising beginnings. A story both strange and beautiful, shaped by divine longing and the kind of twists only the gods could create. Picture a moment when the line between mortal and immortal becomes thin enough to blur, setting events in motion that no one, not even the Olympians, could fully control. This is the beginning of Dionysus, a god born from love, loss, and an ingenuity that would ultimately reshape his fate. And here's where the real curiosity lies. How does a child caught between two worlds become a symbol of joy, ecstasy, and transformation? What makes Dionysus so different from every other Olympian? And why does his story always walk the fine line between chaos and celebration? Before we settle in, tap like if these stories help you unwind, and hit subscribe so you never miss a new mythic journey. And tell me in the comments, which Greek god or goddess fascinates you the most? Let's set the scene. High above Mount Olympus, in a realm where time moves differently than it does for us mortals below, Zeus, king of the gods, master of the sky, and a figure not particularly known for monogamous restraint, found himself captivated by a mortal woman named Semele. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was willing. For a god, that combination was practically irresistible. And so began what would become one of mythology's most cautionary tales about the perils of mixing divinity with humanity, a solution that was as elegant as it was unnecessarily complicated, a signature of divine project management. Semele, princess of Thebes, was no mere conquest to be forgotten in the morning light. Zeus, in what might be described as an uncharacteristic moment of genuine affection. Though with a god of his reputation, one must always read such moments with a healthy dose of skepticism, showered her with attention and tenderness. He came to her in secret, in the darkness, a man made of shadow and starlight. And Semele, caught between the terror and the ecstasy of loving something so far beyond her mortal comprehension, believed herself the luckiest woman in all of Greece. But there was a problem, as there always is when gods involve themselves in the affairs of mortals. Semele became pregnant. Not with a mere child, but with something unprecedented, a being born of both divine essence and mortal flesh, a contradiction in terms, a living paradox. The pregnancy itself was unusual, almost supernatural in its nature. Semele's belly grew heavy with a burden that no ordinary woman should have had to carry, and she felt it constantly. A warmth, a humming, a presence that was distinctly other, yet undeniably hers. Here's something I've always wondered. Do you think Semele ever suspected the true nature of what was growing inside her? Or did she simply assume that all pregnancies felt this strange, this overwhelming? For me, the most unsettling part of her story is that moment of not knowing, that twilight space between mortal understanding and divine reality, where she had to simply endure. Meanwhile, there was someone else watching this unfolding drama with increasing fury. Hera, queen of the gods and Zeus's eternal wife, had developed what might charitably be called a talent for vengeance when it came to her husband's infidelities. Her resentment towards Semele was not merely personal, it was institutional. Hera, never one to let a grudge go to waste, began plotting a revenge of truly cosmic pettiness. She watched the growing scandal with the focused intensity of someone who had spent millennia perfecting the art of making her enemies regret their very existence. Hera's plan was devilishly simple, which made it all the more effective. She transformed herself into an old woman-wise, weathered, kind, and made her way to Semele's chambers. There, in that intimate space where the princess sat alone with her swelling belly and her impossible secret, Hera began to sow seeds of doubt. She asked seemingly innocent questions. "Surely," the old woman said, her voice dripping with false concern, "if Zeus truly loves you as he claims, he would show you his true form. A god who hides his divine nature, well, isn't that just another word for shame?" The words were poison, carefully calibrated to exploit the deepest insecurity of a mortal woman in love with an immortal being. Semele had never seen Zeus as he truly was, not his full divine form, blazing with power and celestial fire. He had always come to her as a man, gentled and humanized for the sake of her fragile mortal frame. But now, listening to this old woman's insinuation, she began to wonder, was he hiding because he was ashamed of her? Or was there something worse he was concealing? When Zeus returned to Semele that night, she confronted him with this question, her voice trembling with both hope and dread. And here's where the story takes a turn that really captures the absurdity of divine relationships. Zeus, in his arrogance and his genuine love for her, swore by the river Styx that he would grant her any wish, no matter what it might be. A dangerous promise, one might think. But then again, gods are not typically known for thinking ahead about consequences. Semele, her heart breaking even as she spoke, asked to see him in his true divine form. In that request was both her greatest desire and her deepest fear. Zeus, bound by his oath, felt the weight of his promise settling upon him like a shroud. He could not refuse. The river Styx, sacred even to the gods themselves, held its word against him. And so, with profound reluctance, with something approaching genuine sorrow, Zeus began to reveal himself to her. The transformation was not gentle. Divine fire is not a thing of beauty to mortal eyes. It is annihilation in another guise. As Zeus's true form emerged, blazing with the light of 1,000 stars, radiating heat that could char flesh and scorch bone, Semele felt her body begin to burn. The glory of the divine was, quite literally, too much for her mortal frame to withstand. In that moment of horrible clarity, she understood what Zeus had been trying to protect her from all along. The woman who had loved a god with all her mortal heart could not survive the knowledge of what he truly was. Semele perished in that fire, her body consumed by the very divinity she had asked to witness. She was barely into her pregnancy, not yet ready to bring forth new life. To any observer, it would have appeared that Zeus's lover had simply burned to death, destroyed by her own reckless demand. A reminder that our ancestors' definition of a divine teaching moment was perhaps more literally incinerating than we might hope for. But Zeus, even in his grief, was not without recourse. As Semele's body fell, consumed by celestial flame, Zeus reached through the burning and grasped something small, still alive, still pulsing with potential. The unborn child. The being that was neither fully divine nor fully mortal, but some strange and unprecedented combination of both. Zeus pulled the child from the ruins of his mother's body and held it close, his divine hands cradling what should have been lost forever. And here, in what might be the most surreal moment of the entire story, Zeus did something that was either brilliant or completely unhinged, depending on your perspective. He couldn't let this child die. The being was too important, too unique, too full of promise. But what container could hold something so unstable, so contrary to the natural order of things? What refuge could he provide? The answer came to him with the kind of desperate ingenuity that only a god can muster. Zeus took the unborn child, still too small, still incomplete, still years away from natural birth, and sewed it into his own thigh. Yes, you read that correctly. His thigh. Not a metaphor, not a poetic embellishment, but the literal divine solution to an impossible problem. Think about that for a moment. What do you imagine it must have felt like for Zeus to carry an unborn child within his own body? For me, the strangest part of this solution is that it actually worked. The unborn Dionysus developed safely within his father's flesh, protected by divine essence itself, shielded from Hera's wrath by virtue of being literally inside the king of the gods. It's the kind of thing that raises questions about divine anatomy that perhaps we're not meant to ask too thoroughly. Hera, of course, discovered what had happened. Her nemesis, the bastard child of her husband's infidelity, had not been destroyed after all. Worse, The child was now being carried by Zeus himself, a living insult to her authority and her dignity. She waited with supernatural patience for the moment of birth, for the moment when the child would emerge from divine protection and become vulnerable to her vengeance. This was only the beginning, though, the first act of a drama that would span years and would ultimately reshape the nature of Dionysus's existence in ways that neither Zeus nor his queen could have fully predicted. For now, though, Zeus carried his impossible burden within his thigh, tending to it with all the care that a divine father could muster, which is to say, the care came mixed with a generous helping of divine indifference to the practical complications. The child grew in darkness and warmth, surrounded by flesh and power, waiting for the moment when he would finally emerge into a world that was not at all prepared for his arrival. And Hera, in her palace on Olympus, continued to wait with the patience of eternity itself, her vengeance already being shaped in the forge of her immortal mind, ready to strike at the moment when he took his first breath in the mortal world. This, then, is the birth of the twice-born god, a being who would be born once from his mother's body and once again from his father's thigh, a child marked from the very moment of his conception by paradox and impossibility. The story of Dionysus begins not with a simple arrival into the world, but with this strange and supernatural liminal space, this time between death and life, between the mortal and the divine, where all the rules of nature seem to bend and break under the weight of divine will. When Zeus finally delivered the child from his thigh, the birth was quiet. No trumpets, no celestial announcement, just the god-king holding something impossibly small and vulnerable in his enormous hands, looking down at the infant with what might have been tenderness, or perhaps just relief that the whole bizarre ordeal was finally over. The child breathed, and cried, and lived, which in itself was a minor miracle considering everything that had already gone wrong. But Zeus knew, with the cold clarity that comes from millennia of divine politics, that Hera would not let this victory stand unchallenged. The Queen of the Gods had patience that could outlast mountains, and a memory for grudges that was functionally eternal. So Zeus did what any responsible father in an impossible situation would do. He outsourced the problem. He summoned Hermes, the divine messenger and problem-solver extraordinaire, the god you called when you needed something, moved quietly and without too many inconvenient questions asked. Hermes, to his credit, didn't ask why the king of the gods was handing him a newborn that had just emerged from a thigh instead of a womb. He simply took the child, wrapped it in whatever divine equivalent of swaddling clothes the gods used for such occasions, and set off into the night with the kind of practiced discretion that suggested this was far from the strangest errand he'd been sent on. The destination was Mount Nysa, a place that exists in that peculiar mythological space where geography becomes more concept than location. Some ancient sources placed it in Boeotia, others in Phoenicia, still others claimed it lay somewhere between Ethiopia and India, or perhaps in Thrace or Arabia. The point being that Mount Nysa was wherever it needed to be to remain safely distant from Hera's watchful eyes. It was a mountain thick with forests, hidden in mist and mystery, where the veil between the mortal and divine grew thin enough that strange things could flourish without attracting too much attention. Here's what I find most fascinating about this part of the story. Zeus chose to hide his son, not in some impregnable fortress, not in the halls of Olympus where he could watch over him personally, but in the wild places of the world, among creatures who lived at the margins of divine society. It was as if he understood, even then, that this child would never fit comfortably into the ordered hierarchies of the gods, that Dionysus needed to grow up in places where the rules were different, where wildness was not a threat, but a birthright. Hermes carried the infant deep into the heart of Mount Nysa, to a cave that smelled of earth and green-growing things, where water trickled over stone and the air stayed warm and moist, even in winter. This was to be Dionysus's nursery, his incubator, a sweet-smelling cave that would protect him from the elements and, more importantly, from divine detection. And there, in that hidden sanctuary, Hermes delivered the twice-born god into the care of beings who would shape him in ways that neither Zeus nor Hera could have fully anticipated. The nymphs of Nysa received the child with the kind of fierce maternal protectiveness that only nature spirits seem capable of manifesting. These were the Nysaiades, creatures of stream and forest, beings who existed in that liminal space between mortality and divinity, neither fully one nor the other, much like the child they were being asked to raise. Some sources name them specifically Cisseus, Nysa, Erato, Eryphia, Bromi, Polyhymno, names that sound like rushing water and wind through leaves, names that belong to the wild places they inhabited. They took the infant into their arms and understood, perhaps better than Zeus himself, what they had been given, not just a child to protect, but a godling whose very nature resonated with the untamed world they called home. In some tellings, Dionysus's care was also entrusted to his aunt Ino, sister to his dead mother Semele, who took him in despite the terrible risk that Hera's vengeance might extend to her own household. For a time, she and her husband Athamas raised the child in secret, disguising him as a girl in the desperate hope that the deception might shield him from the goddess's wrath. But Hera, as always, discovered the truth. Her revenge was characteristically cruel. She drove both Ino and Athamas into madness, so complete that they turned on their own children, destroying their family from within. Some versions of the myth say that Zeus managed to save the young Dionysus before the worst of the carnage, transforming either the child or Athamas into a ram and spiriting him away to the nymphs before blood could be spilled. Either way, the lesson was clear. Hera's reach was long, her patience infinite, and anyone who sheltered Zeus's bastard son did so at profound personal risk. And so Dionysus returned to Mount Nysa, to the nymphs who would raise him in the deep forest where even Hera's gaze could not easily penetrate. It was here, among the Nysaiades and in the company of other wild creatures, that the young god's childhood truly began. The nymphs were not his only companions. Mount Nysa was home to satyrs, half-human, half-goat creatures whose nature was as untamed as the wilderness they inhabited. They were beings of appetite and instinct, of music and revelry, and they took to the young Dionysus with immediate and unquestioning affection. Chief among them was Silenus, an aged satyr whose wisdom was matched only by his fondness for wine and his tendency toward bawdy humour. Silenus became the boy's tutor and guardian, teaching him the secrets of the wild places, the language of beasts, the rhythms of nature that pulsed beneath the surface of the ordered world. Imagine what it must have been like for the young god, growing up in that cave on Mount Nysa, surrounded by beings who answered to no one, who lived according to laws that had nothing to do with Olympian hierarchy or mortal propriety. The nymphs sang to him, not lullabies, but songs that carried the memory of rivers and the whisper of wind through ancient trees. The satyrs taught him to move through the forest without sound, to read the language of animal tracks and shifting shadows, to understand that wildness was not chaos, but a different kind of order entirely. Silenus, for all his apparent foolishness, carried knowledge that went deeper than any scholarly treatise, the kind of wisdom that comes from living close to the earth, from understanding that growth and decay are not opposites, but partners in an endless dance. And the child thrived. Where another god might have grown up learning politics and power in the halls of Olympus, Dionysus learned the secret architecture of vines, the way water finds its path through stone, the pattern of seasons turning in their eternal wheel. He played with the young fauns and the wood nymphs, racing through clearings dappled with sunlight, climbing trees that had stood since before the gods themselves were named. It was during these early years that the first signs of his divine nature began to manifest, and they were strange signs indeed. Not thunder or lightning, not the kinds of powers that Zeus wielded or that Hera commanded, but something subtler and more pervasive. Dionysus discovered that when he touched certain plants, they responded to him in ways they did for no one else. Grapevines in particular, seemed to recognize something in him. They would twist and grow in patterns that defied natural law, reaching toward him as if drawn by invisible strings. One version of the myth describes a moment when the young god, still barely more than a boy, cut a fennel stalk and struck it against the hard rocks of the mountain. Where the stalk touched stone, the rock split open, and from the wound poured not water, but something sweet and intoxicating. The first wine, springing forth from the earth itself in recognition of the child who would become its patron and protector. The nymphs and satyrs tasted it and felt their minds expand, their inhibitions dissolve, their connection to the wild pulse of the world deepen into something that felt very much like divine communion. For me, there's something profound in that image. A child who doesn't command with thunder, but coaxes miracles from stone, whose power manifests not in destruction, but in transformation, in the ability to reveal what was always hidden just beneath the surface. It's the kind of divinity that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but seeps in gradually, changing everything it touches in ways that are impossible to undo. The education Dionysus received on Mount Nysa was nothing like what the other Olympian gods endured. While Apollo learned music as a refined art, Dionysus learned it as ecstasy, the kind of rhythms that make bodies move without conscious thought, that bypass reason entirely and speak directly to something more primal. While Athena mastered strategy and warfare, Dionysus mastered the art of losing control in ways that paradoxically granted a different kind of power. The nymphs taught him that boundaries between self and other, between human and animal, between waking and dreaming, were more permeable than most gods cared to admit. Silenus, in particular, seems to have understood that the boy was destined for something unusual. The old satyr had lived long enough to recognize when the world was shifting beneath his feet, and he saw in young Dionysus the seeds of a revolution that would eventually challenge every assumption the Olympians held dear. So he taught the boy not just survival, but subversion, how to move through society while remaining fundamentally other, how to offer gifts that could not be refused, even when accepting them meant surrendering something essential. There were darker lessons too. Even on Mount Nysa, even surrounded by protectors who would have died to keep him safe, Dionysus could not entirely escape Hera's shadow. The goddess' rage had not diminished. If anything, it had grown sharper with each failed attempt to destroy the child. The nymphs told him stories about his mother, about Semele's terrible death, about the aunt who had gone mad trying to protect him. They wanted him to understand the cost of his existence, the price that others had paid simply because he had been born. I wonder how that shaped him, growing up with the knowledge that he was both precious and dangerous, that his very presence could bring destruction to those who cared for him. It's the kind of awareness that might have crushed a lesser being, but Dionysus seems to have internalized it differently, not as guilt exactly, but as a kind of fundamental understanding that the world was not safe, that love and danger were often inseparable, that transformation always carried a cost. As he grew older, the boy began to venture beyond the immediate environs of the cave. He explored the wild reaches of Mount Nysa, discovering valleys where no mortal foot had ever trod, streams that ran with water so pure it seemed to sing. He learned to identify every plant that grew on the mountain slopes, to understand which ones healed and which ones poisoned, which ones opened the mind to visions and which ones brought only sleep. The grapevine, though. The grapevine was special. From his earliest childhood, Dionysus had felt a connection to it that went beyond affinity into something more like recognition. Where other gods had their sacred animals or talismans, Dionysus had the vine, that peculiar plant that climbed and twisted and produced fruit that could be transformed into a liquid capable of altering consciousness itself. He spent hours studying it, learning its cycles, understanding the alchemy by which grapes became wine. Some sources claim that Dionysus actually invented wine during his time on Mount Nysa, that he was the first to understand the process of fermentation, the magic by which time and patience could transform simple fruit juice into something infinitely more complex. Whether he discovered it or simply perfected what others had begun, the result was the same. He became inseparable from the substance, the god of wine not just in title but in essence. The satyrs and nymphs were his first converts, his original congregation. They drank the wine he made and felt their perception shift, the boundaries of self becoming fluid, the rigid structures of identity dissolving into something more communal, more ecstatic. It wasn't drunkenness as mortals would come to understand it, or rather, it was drunkenness elevated to a religious experience, intoxication as a pathway to divine truth. Here's what strikes me about this period of his life. While the other gods were learning to be Olympian, to be distant, to be perfect, to maintain the hierarchies that kept mortals in their place and gods in theirs, Dionysus was learning the opposite. He was learning that the divine could be accessed through surrender rather than control, that ecstasy could be sacred, that losing yourself might be the quickest path to finding something greater. The nymphs doted on him, these wild women who had taken him in when he was barely more than a bundle of divine potential, wrapped in mortal flesh. They watched him grow from infant to boy to something approaching young manhood, and they saw in him a reflection of everything they loved about the natural world. Its beauty and its danger, its capacity for both creation and destruction, its fundamental refusal to be tamed. When he smiled, flowers bloomed out of season. When he wept, the rain fell more gently, as if the sky itself was trying to console him. When he laughed, which was often, the whole mountain seemed to resonate with the sound, birds taking up the melody, wind carrying it through the valleys, until it seemed that joy itself had become a tangible presence in the air. But there was something else growing in him too, something that the nymphs recognized even if they couldn't name it. A restlessness, perhaps, or a sense that Mount Nysa, for all its wild beauty, was too small to contain what he was becoming. The vine might thrive in hidden valleys, but wine was meant to be shared, and sharing meant leaving the safety of the forest, venturing into the world beyond where Hera's eyes could see him clearly, and her vengeance could finally find its mark. Silenus saw it too, this gathering sense of destiny. The old satyr had grown genuinely fond of the boy. More than fond, really, something approaching the kind of love that transforms both the lover and the beloved. He knew that Dionysus would not stay on Mount Nysa forever, that the time was coming when the twice-born god would have to claim his place in the wider world. And so he redoubled his efforts to prepare the boy, teaching him not just how to survive, but how to thrive in a world that would fear him and desire him in equal measure. The other inhabitants of Mount Nysa, the lesser spirits and the wild animals, the ancient trees and the singing streams, all recognized him as kin. He was the god of their realm in a way that Zeus had never been and never could be. Where the king of the gods commanded from Olympus's height, Dionysus belonged to the earth, to the cycles of growth and rot, to the ecstatic surrender that came with letting the world flow through you, rather than trying to control it. And still Hera watched, her fury undiminished by the passing years. She had not forgotten Semele, had not forgiven Zeus his transgression, and certainly had not abandoned her determination to make the bastard child pay for the crime of existing. The nymphs knew this, felt it in the way certain birds would go silent for no apparent reason, in the occasional cold wind that cut through even the warmest summer day. They kept Dionysus close, varied his routines, made sure he was never predictable enough to be easily targeted. But they also knew, with the quiet fatalism that comes from living close to nature's cycles, that childhood could not last forever. Eventually, Dionysus would have to leave the cave and the mountain, would have to step into his destiny as a god, not just of wine and ecstasy, but of transformation itself, the force that breaks down what is rigid and builds something new from the rubble. The nymphs had given him the tools he would need, the understanding of wildness as sacred, the knowledge that power could flow from surrender as easily as from domination. For now, though, he was still young, still learning, still protected by the green twilight of Mount Nysa and the fierce love of beings who had chosen him as their own. The wine flowed freely in that hidden place, and the nymphs danced with the satyrs under stars that seemed closer there than anywhere else in the world, and Dionysus twice born, marked by tragedy, destined for a kind of godhood that would change everything, laughed and danced with them, his feet moving in rhythms that predated language, his joy as wild and uncontainable as the forests that had raised him. There are moments in a life, mortal or divine, when everything changes, when some fundamental understanding clicks into place and the world rearranges itself around this new knowledge, and nothing that comes after can ever quite return to the way things were before. For Dionysus, that moment came not with thunder or prophecy, but with something far more intimate, a discovery made in the quiet spaces of Mount Nysa, where the boundary between accident and destiny had always been remarkably thin. The most common version of the story suggests that Dionysus encountered the vine as a child, barely more than an infant, watching it grow near the place where the nymphs had laid him to rest. It was just there one day, unremarkable at first, another green thing among the countless green things that covered the mountain slopes. But this plant was different, and the young god felt it immediately, the way you might recognize a voice in a crowd before you've consciously registered the sound. He reached out, as children do, with that fearless curiosity that hasn't yet learned about consequences, and plucked one of the strange custard fruits that hung heavy from the vine's tendrils. The grapes were dark and sweet, bursting with juice when he bit into them, and something in that taste resonated with something deep in his divine nature, a recognition that went beyond mere flavor into the realm of fundamental affinity. The myth says he became drunk from eating those grapes, that first innocent consumption already hinting at the transformative power the fruit would hold once properly understood. The nymphs found him there, giggling at nothing, his small hands stained purple, his eyes unfocused and bright, and they knew immediately that something significant had occurred. But there's another version of the discovery, one that comes later in his youth and carries with it the weight of love and loss. Because with Dionysus, transformation was always purchased at a price, and knowledge always came wrapped in grief. This version speaks of a beautiful satyr boy named Ampelos, whose name itself meant vine, as if he had been walking destiny from the moment he was born. Dionysus loved him, not the way gods typically loved mortals, as passing amusements or temporary distractions, but with genuine affection, the kind that makes you vulnerable, that opens up spaces in your chest you didn't know existed. Ampelos was everything wild and free that Mount Nysa represented, reckless, joyful, beautiful, in the way that young things are beautiful before time and consequence have had their say. He and Dionysus were inseparable, racing through forests, swimming in cold mountain streams, living in that perfect bubble of youth where death seems like something that happens to other people. In other stories, never to you and never to anyone you love. Until, of course, it did. The details vary depending on who's telling the tale, but the core remains consistent. Ampelos died in an accident that was simultaneously random and inevitable, the kind of tragedy that feels cosmically unfair precisely because there's no one to blame, no villain to punish, just the universe being carelessly, catastrophically indifferent. Some say he was gored by a wild bull after mocking the moon goddess Semele, his arrogance meeting with divine retribution in the way that arrogance so often did in the ancient world. Others suggest it was simply an accident while riding a bull, youthful bravado meeting with physics and biology and the unforgiving reality of mortality. Either way, Ampelos died, and Dionysus held his body and understood for the first time what it meant to lose something you couldn't simply will back into existence. The twice-born god, who had himself been rescued from death by divine intervention, discovered that such miracles were not equally distributed, that some losses were permanent in ways that felt fundamentally wrong. But grief, in the hands of a god, doesn't always end where it does for mortals. Dionysus poured ambrosia, the food of the gods, the substance of immortality itself, into Ampelos's wounds, trying to heal what could not be healed, trying to reverse what the universe had decided was final. And something remarkable happened, something that was either divine will or cosmic consolation, or simply the way magic works when desperation and godhood collide. The body transformed, shifting from flesh into plant, from dead matter into living green, and from Ampelos's corpse grew the first grapevine, climbing and twisting as if still reaching for the sky the boy would never see again. Dionysus tended that vine with all the devotion he had once given to the living boy, watering it with his tears, speaking to it in the darkness, watching as it grew and flourished and produced fruit unlike anything the world had seen before. When the grapes ripened, purple-black and heavy with sweetness, he crushed one in his hands. Perhaps accidentally, perhaps deliberately, the myths don't specify, and discovered that the juice carried with it something of the ambrosia he had poured into Ampelos's wounds, some residue of divinity mixed now with mortal fruit. For me, there's something unbearably poignant in that image. A god discovering his greatest gift, not through triumph or wisdom, but through loss, finding in the remnants of tragedy something that would eventually bring joy to millions, yet would always carry within it the shadow of the grief that birthed it. Wine is remembrance, wine is transformation, wine is the substance that lets the living taste death and divinity in equal measure. But discovering wine was one thing, understanding it was something else entirely. The juice that came from those first crushed grapes was sweet, but not yet wine, not yet the substance that would define Dionysus's place in the pantheon, and reshape human civilization in ways both profound and terrible. There was a process, an alchemy of time and patience, and perhaps a touch of divine inspiration that had to be learned. Dionysus watched as the juice sat in containers the nymphs had fashioned for him, vessels of clay and wood that held the liquid as it underwent its mysterious transformation. He didn't understand fermentation, not in the way a modern winemaker would, but he understood the pattern of it. The way the sweet juice would bubble and foam, the way the smell would shift from pure fruit sweetness into something darker, more complex, tinged with an edge that spoke of transformation at a molecular level. He learned by trial and error, by intuition and divine instinct, how long to let the process continue, when to stop it, how to coax from the grapes exactly the effect he wanted. Tea, and when he finally drank the finished product, the first true wine, fermented and potent, and utterly unlike anything that had existed before, he felt it hit his consciousness like a revelation. This was different from the mild intoxication of eating grapes, different even from the euphoria of divine ecstasy he could achieve through other means. This was a gateway, a key that unlocked something in the mind that hadn't previously been accessible, a door into altered states of consciousness that didn't require years of training or divine parentage to access. Wine, Dionysus realized, could make anyone, god, mortal, or something in between, experience a taste of transcendence. It could dissolve the boundaries of self that kept people trapped in their narrow identities, could break down the walls between individuals and create a sense of communal ecstasy that felt genuinely sacred. But it could also destroy, could push too far, could turn ecstasy into oblivion and liberation into chaos. Wine contained within it both the blessing and the curse of transformation. It offered freedom from the mundane, but that freedom came without guarantees, without safety nets, without any promise that you'd return from the journey unchanged or even intact. The nymphs and satyrs of Mount Nysa became Dionysus's first congregation, his original initiates into the mysteries of wine. They gathered around him as he explained what he had discovered, and they drank together in those hidden groves, passing vessels of wine between them and feeling the world shift in its fundamental nature. Silenus, old and wise and deeply attuned to the rhythms of the earth, understood immediately what Dionysus had created. Not just a beverage, but a sacrament, not just intoxication, but a religious experience that could rival anything the other Olympians offered. They danced that night, danced until their feet bled, and the dawn came searching for them through the trees. And in their dancing, they discovered another truth about wine, that it didn't just alter consciousness, it altered the body's relationship to rhythm and movement, made inhibitions fall away like dead leaves, allowed people to express things through motion that language could never capture. This would become central to Dionysian worship. The dance, the ecstatic movement, the surrender to rhythm that felt like possession, as if the god himself was moving through their limbs. Dionysus knew, even in the midst of that first great celebration, that wine was too significant to remain hidden on Mount Nysa. This discovery needed to be shared, needed to spread beyond the mountain's protective isolation and into the wider world. The question was, how, and more importantly, whether the world was ready for what he was offering. The stories of Dionysus spreading viticulture across the known world are many and varied, but they share certain patterns, certain recurring themes that tell us as much about the nature of his gift as they do about the god himself. He travelled, the myths say, from land to land, teaching mortals the art of cultivating the vine, showing them how to crush the grapes and ferment the juice and produce this substance that could transform their experience of reality itself. One early tale speaks of his journey through Syria, where he encountered resistance in the person of Damascus, a king who saw in wine a threat to the established order, to the careful hierarchies that kept society functioning according to predictable rules. Damascus recognized, perhaps more clearly than those who welcomed Dionysus with open arms, that wine was not merely a beverage, but a fundamentally revolutionary substance, something that could undermine authority by offering direct access to ecstatic states that required no intermediary, no priest class, no institutional control. The king opposed the introduction of the vine into his lands, and Dionysus, showing the darker edge of his nature, the violence that lurked beneath the revelry, punished him with a cruelty that became legendary, flaying him alive as a warning to others who might resist the spread of his gift. Nonetheless, it's a disturbing story, one that reminds us that Dionysus was never simply the jolly god of parties and good times. His worship carried within it a strand of genuine danger, a hint that the freedom he offered came with obligations, that refusing his gift could be as perilous as accepting it. He demanded surrender, demanded openness, and those who closed themselves off to his influence did so at their own risk. From Syria, he moved through Asia, the myths becoming less specific about geography and more focused on the pattern of his progress. Everywhere he went, he brought the vine, taught its cultivation, demonstrated the mysteries of fermentation, and established worship in his honor. The Euphrates River posed a challenge: how to cross with his followers and his precious cargo of vine cuttings. But Dionysus built a bridge, demonstrating that his power extended beyond wine into the realm of practical engineering, that transformation could be both spiritual and material. When he reached different cities, he employed various methods to introduce wine to the population. Sometimes he would teach a single individual, often a shepherd or farmer, someone close to the earth, who would understand the agricultural implications of what he was offering. There's a beautiful story from Tyre about a shepherd named Staphylos, whose name meant grape cluster, as if he too had been destined for this encounter from birth. Dionysus appeared at Staphylos' humble dwelling and was offered hospitality, food and water, the simple provisions a poor man could provide. But Dionysus transformed the water in his cup into wine with a gesture, and when Staphylos tasted it, his mind exploded with questions, his entire understanding of what was possible undergoing a fundamental revision. The god then led him to a vine, showed him how to crush the grapes, explained the process of fermentation, and made him the first winemaker in Tyre, the person through whom wine would spread throughout the region. This became a pattern. Dionysus, identifying individuals who could serve as his ambassadors, his distributors of the gift, teaching them not just the mechanics of viticulture, but the sacred dimension of it. The understanding that wine was never merely agricultural produce, but always also a conduit to the divine. In Greece, he taught Icarius, making him one of the first to spread the practice of wine cultivation through Attica. Icarius's story would end in tragedy. His neighbors, experiencing intoxication for the first time and not understanding what was happening to them, believed he had poisoned them and killed him in their panic. But the vine took root nonetheless, spreading despite the violence, despite the misunderstanding, as unstoppable as transformation itself. What strikes me about these myths of wine's spread is how they acknowledge both the gift and the danger inherent in what Dionysus was offering. Wine could bring joy, could create community, could open minds to divine truth, but it could also be misunderstood, could cause panic, could lead to violence when people didn't know how to manage the altered states it produced. Dionysus was giving humanity a tool of tremendous power, but like any tool, its effects depended entirely on how it was wielded and by whom. The god himself seemed aware of this duality. In some versions of his teaching, he emphasized moderation, the careful balance between ecstasy and oblivion. Wine diluted with water was the Greek custom, a way of extending the social pleasure of drinking while reducing the risk of complete intoxication. But in his religious rites, Dionysus demanded the opposite: undiluted wine consumed to the point of genuine ecstasy, the deliberate obliteration of ordinary consciousness in service of touching something greater. This is the paradox at the heart of Dionysian wine culture. It was simultaneously a civilizing force, something that facilitated social bonding and cultural refinement, and a dissolving force, something that could break down civilization's careful structures and reveal the wild, primal nature that civilization was built to contain. Dionysus embodied both aspects without apology, refusing to choose between them, insisting that both were necessary, that humanity needed the order and the chaos, the control and the surrender, the civilization and the wildness. As wine spread, so too did stories of Dionysus's power over it, his ability to manifest it through miracles that demonstrated his intimate connection to the substance. At Elis, during his festival called Thuria, priests would seal 3 empty basins in a building, and the next morning they would be full of wine, produced from nothing, through the god's presence alone. On the island of Andros, a spring that normally flowed with water would run with wine on the night of January 5th-6th during the festival of Theodosia, though the wine would turn back to water if removed from the sacred grounds. In Chios, at his temple on the Ionian coast, springs poured out wine instead of water on fixed days each year, wine of unusual fragrance that testified to its supernatural origin. These miracles served a purpose beyond mere demonstration of divine power. They reinforced the idea that wine was not simply a human product, but a divine gift, that drinking it was not merely recreational, but potentially sacred, that in consuming wine one was consuming something that carried within it the presence of the god himself. Wine was Dionysus's earthly incarnation, the physical form through which the god made himself accessible to mortal worshippers. To drink wine with the proper reverence, the proper intention, was to take the god into yourself, to allow divine essence to mingle with mortal flesh in a kind of communion that predated and perhaps inspired later religious practices. But Dionysus also demonstrated that this power could be used defensively, that wine could protect as well as transform. The famous story of his encounter with Tyrrhenian pirates illustrates this perfectly. The pirates, seeing what appeared to be a beautiful young man traveling alone, decided to kidnap him, presumably for ransom or worse. They seized him and brought him aboard their ship, binding him with ropes that mysteriously kept falling away, as if the bonds couldn't quite grip his divine flesh. Then Dionysus revealed himself. Vines burst from the ship's mast, growing with impossible speed and wrapping around the rigging like serpents. Wine flowed across the deck, appearing from nowhere, the smell of it mixing with salt air and terror. Dionysus himself transformed, no longer a helpless victim, but a figure of terrifying divine power, and the pirates, confronted with the reality of what they had attempted to capture, lost their minds completely. They threw themselves overboard in their panic, and Dionysus, in a final act that mixed mercy with irony, transformed them into dolphins, creatures that would spend eternity in the sea they had tried to escape, forever changed by their encounter with transformation itself. The story served as a warning that wine and the god who gave it could not be controlled or captured, that attempts to commodify or constrain this power would end in madness and metamorphosis. Dionysus offered his gift freely, but on his own terms, and those terms required a kind of surrender that many found profoundly threatening. As viticulture spread across the ancient world, wine began to reshape society in ways that went far beyond simple agriculture. The symposium in Greece, the Bacchanalia in Rome, these social institutions centered around wine consumption became spaces where political alliances were formed, philosophical ideas debated, artistic inspiration cultivated. Wine loosened tongues, lowered inhibitions, created an environment where hierarchy could be temporarily suspended and ideas could flow more freely than they did in sober daylight. But it also created new problems. Alcoholism emerged as a recognized condition, the understanding that some people couldn't manage the gift Dionysus had given, that for them wine was not a path to ecstasy, but a road to destruction. The Greeks and Romans developed complex cultural rules around wine consumption, specifically to manage this danger. The dilution with water, the symposiarch who controlled the mixing ratio, the understanding that uncontrolled drinking was barbaric, while properly regulated drinking was civilized. Yet Dionysus himself seemed to exist outside these rules, or perhaps above them. His worship deliberately violated the very boundaries that civilized wine culture tried to establish. His followers, the Maenads, wild women who left their homes and families to worship in the mountains, drank undiluted wine and tore apart animals with their bare hands, achieving states of ecstasy that terrified those who witnessed them. They proved that wine, when used in its full sacred context, could access something genuinely divine, but also genuinely dangerous, a power that civilization couldn't fully contain or control. Dionysus travelled on, carrying his vine cuttings and his sacred knowledge, and everywhere he went, the world changed. The landscape itself transformed, hillsides that had been bare becoming covered with vineyards, agricultural calendars reorienting around the grape harvest, entire economies restructuring themselves around the production and trade of wine. He was reshaping human civilization at a fundamental level, introducing a substance that would become so central to Mediterranean culture that it's difficult to imagine that world without it. And through it all, he carried the memory of Ampelos, the boy whose death had led to wine's discovery, whose transformation from flesh to vine represented everything Dionysus would come to embody. Every grape crushed was a kind of remembrance, every fermentation a continuation of that first miraculous change from death to life to death again, to something that transcended both. Wine was grief made drinkable, love made liquid, transformation made manifest in a form that anyone could consume and everyone could understand, at least in the moment of drinking, at least while the god was present in their veins. The discovery of wine was complete, but the story of what humanity would do with it, that story was only beginning. Dionysus had given mortals a tool for touching the divine, but he had also given them a weapon they could turn against themselves, a key that could unlock transcendence or madness depending on the hand that turned it. He would spend the rest of his existence navigating that contradiction, being simultaneously celebrated and feared, worshipped and resisted, the god who brought the greatest gift and the most dangerous, the liberator who was also the destroyer, the twice-born who taught that death was never final and transformation was always possible, even when, especially when, it came at a price no one wanted to pay. There comes a point in every god's existence when the familiar becomes insufficient, when the boundaries of home, no matter how wild, no matter how safe, begin to feel like walls rather than protection. For Dionysus, that moment arrived gradually, like wine seeping through cloth, until one morning he woke on Mount Nysa, surrounded by everything he had ever known and understood with sudden crystalline clarity that he could not stay. The nymphs saw it in his eyes before he spoke the words, and they grieved even as they helped him prepare, because they had always known this day would come, had known since the moment Zeus placed the infant god in their care that they were raising him not for themselves, but for the world beyond their hidden valleys. But before Dionysus could truly begin his wandering, before he could carry wine and transformation to the farthest reaches of the known world, Hera made her final, most devastating move. The Queen of the Gods had been watching, waiting with the patience that only immortals possess, and when Dionysus finally ventured beyond the protection of Mount Nysa, she struck with precision and cruelty. She drove him mad. Not the ecstatic madness that would later become central to his worship, not the liberating frenzy that dissolved boundaries and opened minds to divine truth, but genuine insanity, the kind that fractures consciousness, that turns the world into a nightmare landscape where nothing makes sense, and terror is the only constant. Dionysus, the god who would eventually master all forms of altered consciousness, found himself trapped in a state he couldn't control or escape, his divine mind turning against itself in ways that would have killed a mortal outright. He wandered, not with purpose now, but with the aimless desperation of the truly lost, through Egypt, where King Proteus took pity on him and offered what comfort he could to a mad god stumbling through his kingdom. But Proteus had no cure for what Hera had inflicted, and so Dionysus moved on, driven by compulsions he couldn't name, crossing into Syria where his madness made him dangerous in ways that even he, in his fractured state, could barely comprehend. It was in Phrygia that salvation finally came, in the form of the goddess Cybele, sometimes called Rhea, the mother goddess whose worship was as ancient and wild as the earth itself. She recognized him immediately, saw past the madness to the divine essence beneath, and understood perhaps better than any other deity what Hera had done and why. Cybele took Dionysus into her care and performed purification rituals that were older than the Olympians themselves, washing away the madness Hera had inflicted and restoring his mind to clarity. But the experience changed him. When Dionysus emerged from Cybele's sanctuary, purified and sane once more, he was no longer the relatively innocent god who had left Mount Nysa. He had experienced madness from the inside, had felt what it meant to lose control, not joyfully but terrifyingly, and that knowledge would inform everything he did afterward. In gratitude, he adopted Phrygian dress, the flowing robes and distinctive headwear that would become associated with his worship, and learned from Cybele the mysteries of her cult, rituals that involved ecstatic dancing, wild music, and the kind of boundary dissolution that he would eventually make central to his own religious practice. From Phrygia, purified and transformed, Dionysus began his true wandering, not as a victim fleeing persecution, but as a teacher and proselytizer, carrying wine and its mysteries to every land he encountered. His journey would take him through Asia Minor, across deserts and mountains, through kingdoms that had never heard his name, and cities that would learn to worship him or learn to fear him, depending on how they chose to receive his gift. Sinits, Syria was early on his route, and here the pattern that would define his travels was established immediately and violently. King Damascus, ruler of that land, heard of the approaching god who claimed dominion over wine and ecstasy, and he made a decision that would cost him everything. He refused to recognize Dionysus's divinity, forbade the introduction of viticulture into his kingdom, and ordered his soldiers to drive the god out by force. It was the wrong choice, made perhaps from fear or conservative piety, or simple inability to comprehend what Dionysus represented. The god's response was swift and merciless. Dionysus didn't just kill Damascus, he flayed him alive, removing the king's skin piece by piece as a demonstration of what happened to those who resisted transformation so completely that they became obstacles to be removed rather than souls to be converted. It was brutal, excessive, the kind of divine punishment that made mortals whisper in horror and gods raise their eyebrows in appreciation of the message being sent. Wine was being offered freely, but refusal carried consequences that were anything but gentle. From Syria, Dionysus continued eastward into the deeper reaches of Asia, following routes that took him far from the Greek world he had been born into lands where Zeus was unknown and wine was a mystery still waiting to be revealed. The myths speak of him reaching the Euphrates River, that great waterway that marked the boundary between the familiar world and the exotic East, and finding himself faced with a practical problem: how to get his growing retinue of followers, his sacred objects, and himself across. The solution was characteristically inventive. Dionysus constructed a bridge, though whether this was a physical structure or some divine manipulation of space and matter, the myths don't specify. Some versions suggest that Zeus sent him a tiger who carried him across the Tigris, that other great river whose name echoes the beast that transported the god. Either way, the point was clear: natural boundaries meant nothing to Dionysus. Geography could not contain him, and the spreading of wine would not be stopped by mere water, no matter how wide or deep. The most famous part of his Asian wanderings was his campaign in India, a journey that the myths describe as lasting 3 years and taking him to the absolute edge of the known world. This was no mere missionary journey, but a full military campaign, though one conducted in ways that would have baffled conventional generals. Dionysus led an army composed not of trained soldiers, but of satyrs and Maenads, wild men and wilder women, creatures whose weapons were thyrsois rather than spears, whose armour was fawn, skins rather than bronze, whose battle cry was ecstatic ululation rather than organised war chants. They conquered India not through superior tactics or military discipline, but through something far more subversive: wine and dance. Dionysus rode at their head in a chariot pulled by panthers, exotic beasts that embodied the wildness he represented, and everywhere his army went, they planted vines, taught fermentation, held festivals that were simultaneously religious ceremonies and revolutionary acts. The Indians, encountering this strange god who offered liberation through intoxication, found themselves unable to resist, not because they were defeated militarily, but because they were seduced culturally, transformed from potential enemies into willing converts. Imagine trying to fight an army whose primary tactic was to make you want to join them, whose assault on your culture came not through force, but through offering something so profoundly appealing that resistance felt like self-denial. That was the genius and the danger of Dionysian conquest. It didn't need to destroy what it encountered, it simply transformed it, absorbed it, made it part of the ever-growing celebration that followed in the god's wake. But not everyone welcomed transformation. As Dionysus travelled, he encountered rulers and populations who saw in wine and ecstasy not liberation but threat, not divine gift but dangerous dissolution of the social order that kept civilization functioning. And for these resistors, Dionysus reserved punishments that demonstrated just how dangerous a god of madness could be when his gifts were spurned. In Thrace, on the northern border of the Greek world, King Lycurgus made the catastrophic mistake of refusing to honour Dionysus. When the god and his followers entered Lycurgus's territory, the king not only denied them hospitality, he actively attacked them, driving the Maenads into the sea, imprisoning those he could capture, and attempting to kill Dionysus himself. For someone who had survived Hera's persecution, who had been twice born and driven mad and purified by ancient goddesses, Lycurgus's aggression must have seemed almost laughably insufficient. Dionysus's revenge was perfect in its precision and cruelty. He didn't strike Lycurgus down immediately. Instead, he drove the king mad. In his divinely induced insanity, Lycurgus mistook his own son for a grapevine and killed the boy, hacking away at what he perceived as invasive plant growth while actually murdering his heir. When sanity returned, and Lycurgus realized what he had done, the horror of it shattered him completely. But Dionysus wasn't finished. The land itself became barren, cursed by the gods' displeasure, and the people of Thrace, facing starvation and divine wrath for their king's actions, received a prophecy that the blight would only lift when Lycurgus was punished. They knew what had to be done, and in a scene that speaks to the absolute terror Dionysus could inspire, the Thracians took their king to Mount Pangaean and bound him there, letting wild horses tear him apart piece by piece, until nothing remained of the man who had dared to imprison Maenads and attack a god. The message rippled outward from Thrace like wine spilling across a table. Dionysus could not be resisted without consequence, his gifts could not be refused without punishment, and those who tried to exclude wine from their kingdoms did so at mortal peril. But the most haunting of all his vengeances came not against a warrior king, but against ordinary women, against the daughters of King Minyas in Orchomenos, who made the simple, fatal mistake of refusing to join his worship. While other women of the city abandoned their looms and households to dance in the mountains with Dionysus's followers, the three Minyan sisters, Alcitho, Leucippe, and Arcippe, stayed home, declaring that their domestic duties were more important than revelry, that civilized women didn't abandon propriety to chase after strange gods in the wilderness. It was exactly the kind of rejection Dionysus could not tolerate, not because it was violent, but because it was dismissive, because it represented the domestication and civilization of women, the containment of female energy within household walls, the denial of the wild, ecstatic dimension of human experience in favor of weaving and spinning and all the proper activities that kept women controlled and controllable. Dionysus came to them, not in his divine form initially, but as a series of visions and manifestations designed to convince rather than compel. He appeared as a young girl, arguing gently that they should honor the god. When that failed, he transformed into a bull, then a lion, then a leopard, each form more threatening than the last, demonstrating his power and demanding recognition. And still the daughters of Minyas sat at their looms, stubbornly insisting on their right to refuse. So Dionysus stopped asking. Darkness fell over their workroom in the middle of the day, supernatural and complete. Drums and cymbals sounded from nowhere, filling the air with the kind of rhythm that bypasses conscious thought and speaks directly to the body. Ivy and grapevines erupted from their looms, transforming the tools of domestic order into instruments of wild nature. The house itself seemed to shake, as if the very walls were rejecting the attempt to keep wildness outside. And then came the madness. Not the ecstatic madness of willing Maenads, but the terrifying madness of those who resist transformation until it breaks them from the inside. The three sisters, in their divinely induced frenzy, looked at Alcithio's son Hippasus, and saw not a child but a sacrificial animal. They tore him apart with their bare hands, three women driven so far beyond sanity that they committed the one crime even the gods found nearly unforgivable. They murdered their own blood. When the madness lifted and they understood what they had done, the horror was so complete that Dionysus showed something approaching mercy. He transformed them into bats, creatures of darkness and caves, forever fleeing the light, forever marked by their refusal to honor what he represented. It was a kinder fate than living with the memory of what they had become, though whether they experienced it that way the myths don't say. For me, the pattern of these punishments reveals something essential about Dionysus's nature and his mission. He wasn't simply spreading wine as an agricultural product or ecstasy as a pleasant experience. He was challenging the fundamental structures of civilization itself, demanding that humanity acknowledge the wild, untamed aspects of existence that society worked so hard to contain and control. Those who could bend, who could incorporate wine and wildness into their lives while maintaining enough structure to function, they thrived under his influence. But those who tried to exclude it entirely, who attempted to keep the walls high and the boundaries firm, discovered that Dionysus would not be kept out, and that the transformation he demanded would happen whether they consented or not, though the unwilling paid a higher price. His journey through Asia and the Mediterranean became legendary not just for its geographical extent, but for the sheer number of converts and casualties it left in its wake. Everywhere Dionysus went, he fundamentally altered the culture he encountered, not just by introducing wine, but by challenging assumptions about consciousness, about the relationship between human and divine, about the space civilization should leave for wildness and ecstasy. In some places, his arrival was celebrated immediately. Kings and peasants alike welcomed the god who brought pleasure and transformation, who offered direct access to divine experience without requiring years of training or priestly intermediation. They planted vines in his honor, built temples to house his worship, held festivals where wine flowed freely and boundaries, social, sexual, psychological, dissolved into temporary unity. But in other places, resistance continued until Dionysus broke it, sometimes gently through persuasion and miracles, sometimes violently through madness and metamorphosis. Each punishment became another story, another warning, another demonstration that this god could not be dismissed as merely the bringer of drunkenness and revelry. He was transformation itself, and transformation, real transformation, is never entirely safe, never fully controllable, never something you can take just a little of and then return unchanged to your ordinary life. The satyrs and Maenads who followed him grew in number as his journey continued, the original nymphs of Nysa joined by converts from every land he visited. They became an institution unto themselves, this wild retinue that moved across Asia like a living storm, planting vines and holding orgies, dancing themselves into states of possession and tearing apart animals and occasionally people with their bare hands. They were proof of what Dionysian worship could achieve and warning of what it could cost, embodiments of ecstasy that lived permanently in the altered states others could only visit temporarily. Silenus accompanied him through much of this journey, the old satyr who had tutored him on Mount Nysa now serving as advisor and companion, the wise fool who could speak truth to divine power because his apparent foolishness gave him license others lacked. Their relationship was deep and genuine, master and student having reversed roles multiple times until the categories no longer applied, until they were simply two beings who understood each other in ways that required no explanation. When Dionysus finally completed his circuit of Asia and began turning back toward Greece, he carried with him the accumulated evidence of his divinity, the transformed lands, the converted populations, the punished resistors, the legends that had begun forming even before his work was finished. He had proven, through years of wandering and teaching and avenging, that he was not merely Zeus's bastard son, but a god in his own right, with powers that rivaled and in some ways exceeded those of the established Olympians. But the journey had changed him too. The relatively innocent god who had left Mount Nysa had become something harder, more complex, carrying within him both the joy of willing conversion and the darkness of necessary punishment. He had learned that transformation required both the offering and the ultimatum, that liberation could be gentle or violent depending on circumstance, that his role as god of ecstasy made him simultaneously beloved and feared in ways that simpler deities never experienced. The vines he had planted across Asia would continue producing grapes long after he moved on, each harvest a reminder of his passage, each fermentation a continuation of the work he had begun. Wine had become permanent, woven into the fabric of human civilization so thoroughly that future generations would barely remember a time before it existed. And everywhere that wine was made and consumed, Dionysus was present, not just in memory, but in the actual effect of the substance, the way it dissolved boundaries and opened consciousness to possibilities that sobriety kept carefully hidden. He was wanderer, teacher, and avenger, three roles that were ultimately inseparable, three faces of the same divine being. The wandering was necessary because transformation had to spread, had to be offered to everyone regardless of geography or culture. The teaching was necessary because wine required knowledge, understanding, proper context, to be transformative rather than merely destructive. And the avenging was necessary because some resistances could not be overcome with patience, because transformation demanded surrender, and those who refused to bend had to be broken as warnings to others still deciding which path to choose. First to so. As Dionysus moved closer to Greece, to the land of his birth and the final proving ground of his divinity, he carried all of this with him, the wisdom earned through wandering, the techniques perfected through teaching, the ruthlessness revealed through vengeance. He was returning not as the child who had been hidden away to protect him from Hera's wrath, but as a god who had conquered Asia, who had planted his worship in the farthest reaches of the known world, who had demonstrated beyond doubt that he could not be denied, could not be contained, could not be anything other than what he was: wild, liberating, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. See double. The twice-born god had been born yet again through his travels, transformed by the very transformations he had inflicted on others, and he was finally ready to claim his place among the Olympians, to bring wine and madness and ecstasy into the heart of divine civilization itself, to force even Zeus and Hera to acknowledge what they had tried so hard to destroy. The wandering was ending, but the revolution, the real revolution that wine represented, was only just beginning. By the time Dionysus had completed his circuit of the known world and begun turning his attention back toward Greece, he was no longer simply a god with a gift to offer. He had become the center of something unprecedented, a religious movement that operated according to principles fundamentally different from anything the established Olympian pantheon had created. What grew up around him wasn't merely worship in the conventional sense, temples and priests performing prescribed rituals at prescribed times, but something far more organic and dangerous, a cult in the truest sense of the word, an ecstatic practice that promised direct, unmediated experience of the divine through methods that civilization had spent centuries trying to suppress. The Dionysian cult didn't ask for belief. It demanded participation. You couldn't understand what Dionysus offered by reading about it or listening to someone else's description any more than you could understand wine by studying chemistry. The only path to knowledge was through direct experience, through allowing the god to enter your body and transform your consciousness from the inside out, through surrendering control so completely that the boundary between worshipper and deity dissolved entirely. This was revolutionary, and the established order, both divine and mortal, recognized immediately how profoundly threatening it was. At the heart of Dionysian worship was the concept of ecstasy, though not in the diminished way we use that word today to mean simple happiness or pleasure. The Greek ecstasis meant literally standing outside oneself, the temporary dissolution of the carefully maintained ego boundary that separated individual consciousness from everything else. Dionysus offered his followers a chance to step outside their identities, to become something other than what they were, to experience existence from a perspective that transcended the limitations of individual human consciousness. The primary vehicle for achieving this state was wine, naturally, consumed in quantities and concentrations that would have horrified the respectable symposium culture of upper-class Greek men. While civilized drinking involved careful dilution with water, measured consumption, philosophical discussion, Dionysian worship demanded the opposite. Undiluted wine drunk rapidly until ordinary consciousness began to fracture and something else could emerge in its place. But wine alone wasn't sufficient. It was the catalyst, not the destination. The rites themselves took place outside the boundaries of civilization, in the mountains and forests where the wild still reigned, where the ordered categories that defined civic life lost their power. The timing was deliberate tonight, when vision became uncertain and the familiar world transformed into something strange and potentially sacred, when darkness obscured the details that kept the rational mind anchored to ordinary reality. The worshippers would gather, sometimes secretly, sometimes with official sanction depending on the place and period, and begin the process of inducing the altered state that would allow the god to manifest. Music was essential, not the refined, controlled music of Apollo's lyre, but something more primal, drums and cymbals and flutes playing rhythms designed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to the body. The sound would build, relentless and insistent, until it became impossible to remain still, until movement became involuntary, as if the rhythm itself was animating your limbs. Dancing followed naturally, not the choreographed movements of formal ritual, but something wilder, more chaotic, spinning until dizziness dissolved any sense of fixed orientation, thrashing until exhaustion opened cracks in the armor of selfhood. The worshippers, and this is crucial, wore masks. By covering their faces with representations of the god, of satyrs, of various divine and semi-divine beings, they were engaging in a form of sacred theatre, where the boundary between representation and reality became permeable. When you wore the mask of Dionysus and danced yourself into frenzy, were you still yourself pretending to be the god, or had you become a vessel through which the god actually manifested? The distinction collapsed in the ecstatic state, and that collapse was precisely the point. For me, what's most striking about these rites is how calculated they were, how every element was designed to systematically dismantle the psychological structures that kept people locked into their ordinary identities. This wasn't random drunken revelry, it was a sophisticated technology for inducing altered states, a carefully constructed pathway to mystical experience that had been refined over generations of practice. Dionysus had created something unprecedented, a democratic mysticism, ecstatic experience available to anyone willing to participate, rather than being the exclusive domain of specially trained priests or naturally gifted mystics. The Maenads embodied this principle most dramatically. These women, and it's significant that the most devoted followers of Dionysus were female, left their homes, their families, their carefully prescribed social roles, and went to the mountains to worship in ways that violated every principle of proper feminine behavior. They weren't mythological figures, despite how the myths portrayed them. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence confirms that real women actually did this, actually formed groups called thiasoi, and engaged in practices that would have seemed incomprehensible to their contemporaries. The Maenads wore fawn skins rather than proper Greek dress, crowned themselves with ivy and grape leaves rather than respectable veils, and carried the thyrsus, a fennel stalk wrapped with ivy and topped with a pine cone that served as both ritual object and weapon. When properly wielded by someone in an ecstatic state, the myths claimed the thyrsus could strike water from rocks, could knock down trees, could defend against attackers with supernatural force. Whether these accounts reflect literal truth or the kind of hyper-reality that ecstatic states produce, where subjective experience becomes indistinguishable from objective fact, the thyrsus remained the primary symbol of Dionysian power, the tool that marked its bearer as someone who had stepped outside ordinary human limitations. The Maenads danced in the mountains, performing what was called the aurabasia, literally mountain walking, though the term hardly captures the reality of what occurred. They would dance for hours, sometimes all night, working themselves into states of possession where Dionysus himself was believed to inhabit their bodies, where their consciousness was temporarily overwritten by divine presence. In this condition they were said to possess supernatural strength, to feel no pain, to be capable of feats that would have been impossible in their ordinary state. And they practiced sparagmos and omophagia, the tearing apart of live animals and the consumption of raw flesh. This was not metaphorical, not symbolic. Sources from multiple periods confirm that this actually happened, that women in states of ecstatic frenzy would seize young animals, tear them to pieces with their bare hands, and eat the flesh while it was still warm and bleeding. The logic, if we can call it that, was ritual identification. The animal represented Dionysus himself, and by consuming its raw flesh, the Maenads were literally taking the god into themselves, achieving a form of communion that made the later Christian Eucharist look tame by comparison. Modern scholars spent decades trying to explain this away, trying to find gentler interpretations that wouldn't require acknowledging that civilized Greek women actually engaged in such savage practices. But the evidence is too consistent, too widespread, appearing in too many sources from too many periods, to dismiss as mythological exaggeration. The homophagia happened, and it happened because the Dionysian cult understood something profound about transformation, that real change requires shocking the system, breaking through the carefully maintained boundaries that keep people safe and sane and separate. The male followers, satyrs in the mythological versions, though real men also participated in less gender-exclusive forms of worship, brought their own energy to the cult. Half human, half goat in their mythical form, the satyrs represented unrestrained sexuality, appetite unconstrained by social convention, the animal aspect of human nature given form and voice. They danced with permanent erections, pursued nymphs and Maenads with equal enthusiasm, embodied the understanding that Dionysian liberation included the sexual dimension that polite society worked so hard to contain and regulate. Silenus remained among them, the old satyr who had raised Dionysus, now serving as a kind of mascot and wise fool to the entire movement. Usually depicted as drunk, riding a donkey because he was too inebriated to walk, Silenus nonetheless carried profound wisdom. The understanding that came from a lifetime of living close to nature, close to truth, unencumbered by the illusions that civilization required for its maintenance. He was what Dionysian worship could produce when practiced over a lifetime, someone simultaneously ridiculous and sacred, whose apparent foolishness concealed genuine insight into the nature of existence. But here's the essential paradox that defined the entire cult. Dionysus was simultaneously the god of ecstatic bliss and the god of terrifying madness, and there was no way to access one without risking the other. The same practices that could produce mystical union with the divine, that could dissolve ego boundaries and create profound experiences of interconnection, could also destroy consciousness entirely, could drive worshippers into states of genuine psychosis from which they never returned. The madness Dionysus inflicted on those who refused him, on Lycurgus, on the daughters of Minyas, on Pentheus, when the king of Thebes tried to suppress Dionysian worship in his city. This wasn't qualitatively different from the madness he granted to his willing followers. It was the same force, the same dissolution of ordinary consciousness, but experienced as curse rather than blessing, because it was imposed rather than chosen, because it lacked the ritual container that made ecstasy transformative rather than destructive. Euripides understood this better than perhaps any other ancient writer, and his play, the Bacchae, remains the most profound exploration of the dual nature of Dionysian worship. In that tragedy, Dionysus returns to Thebes, disguised as his own priest, leading a group of Maenads from Asia, demanding recognition from the city where his mother Semele had died. King Pentheus, representing rational order and masculine authority, refuses to honor what he sees as a dangerous foreign cult that threatens to undermine social stability. The conflict is inevitable and devastating. Pentheus cannot contain Dionysus. The god escapes every prison, destroys every chain, demonstrates that rational control has no power over what he represents. And when Pentheus tries to spy on the Maenads to understand what they're doing in the mountains, Dionysus drives the king's own mother Agave into a frenzy so complete that she tears her son apart with her bare hands, believing in her madness that she's killing a lion. Come. When Agave returns to the city carrying Pentheus's severed head on her thyrsus, still in the grip of divine possession, still believing she's achieved some great victory, the horror of what has happened cuts through every category that might make it comprehensible. She has murdered her own son, the most fundamental violation of natural law, and she did it while worshipping a god of liberation and joy. The play offers no easy answers, no simple moral. Dionysus was right to demand recognition. Pentheus was wrong to refuse it, but the cost of that refusal falls not on the king alone but on his family, on the entire social fabric of the city. This is what made Dionysian worship so profoundly unsettling to the ancient world. It revealed that the same forces that could bring ecstatic joy and mystical insight could also produce violence and madness, and the line between them was impossibly thin. You couldn't have the liberation without risking the destruction, couldn't open yourself to divine possession without accepting that sometimes what possessed you might not be benign. The cult spread despite this danger, or perhaps because of it. Throughout Greece, across the Mediterranean, into Rome where Dionysus was called Bacchus and his rites became the Bacchanalia, people chose to risk the madness for a chance at the ecstasy. Mystery cults formed around Dionysian worship, small voluntary organizations of initiates who underwent secret rituals designed to prepare them for the full experience of the god. These mystery cults promised something extraordinary, not just temporary ecstatic experience, but genuine transformation, a kind of rebirth that would fundamentally alter the initiate's relationship to existence and death. The Dionysian mysteries were linked to Orphic teachings, which claimed that humans contained a divine spark that could be liberated through proper ritual practice. Death was not the end, but a transition, and those who had been properly initiated into Dionysian mysteries could expect a blessed afterlife rather than the grey existence that awaited most souls in Hades. The initiates prepared for this afterlife by living differently in the present. Some Orphic Dionysian sects practiced vegetarianism, refusing to eat meat in recognition of the divine spark present in all living things. They were buried with gold leaves inscribed with instructions for navigating the underworld, passwords and directions that would allow the deceased soul to avoid pitfalls and reach the blessed realm reserved for initiates. This was religion offering not just comfort or community, but actual technology for transcending death, concrete practices, and knowledge that could transform your eternal fate. The public festivals dedicated to Dionysus took these principles and scaled them up, made them civic rather than secret, though always retaining an edge of the wild and transgressive. In Athens, the Dionysia became one of the most important festivals of the year, a multi-day celebration that included processions with giant phalluses, symbols of fertility and generative power, that polite society normally kept hidden, carried through the streets while crowds cheered and drunken revelers mocked passers-by. The dramatic competitions that became central to the Dionysia represented another form of Dionysian transformation. Theatre, particularly tragedy, emerged directly from Dionysian ritual. The actor wearing a mask and playing a character was engaging in the same kind of boundary dissolution as the Maenad wearing the mask of the god. The audience watching these tragedies underwent their own form of catharsis, experiencing vicariously emotions and situations that ordinary life kept carefully contained, achieving a kind of purification through controlled exposure to what civilization normally suppressed. Dionysus had invented or inspired an art form that could deliver some of the transformative power of his ecstatic rites in a form that was safe enough for civic consumption, that could challenge and transform consciousness without requiring participants to literally tear apart animals in mounting forests. It was genius, a way of spreading his influence throughout society rather than keeping it confined to those brave or desperate enough to risk full initiation. But the rites themselves never disappeared, never became entirely domesticated. Throughout the classical period and into the Hellenistic and Roman eras, groups of women continued to go to the mountains, continued to dance themselves into ecstatic states, continued to practice forms of worship that civilized authorities found alternately fascinating and terrifying. The Roman Senate actually tried to suppress the Bacchanalia in 1806 BCE, claiming they had become covers for conspiracy and moral corruption, though the real threat was probably the way these rites empowered women and lower-class citizens, giving them experiences of autonomy and power that threatened established hierarchies. The suppression was brutal, but incomplete. Dionysian worship was too deeply embedded, too profoundly appealing to be eliminated by senatorial decree. It continued in various forms, sometimes underground, sometimes with official tolerance, until Christianity finally displaced the old gods and their cults, though even then echoes of Dionysian practice persisted in Christian mysticism, in ecstatic religious movements, in the understanding that direct experience of the divine was possible through methods that dissolved ordinary consciousness. Nat. Throughout all of this, the public festivals and secret mysteries, the ecstatic dancing and tragic theatre, the spread across the Mediterranean, and the attempts at suppression. Dionysus remained what he had always been, the god who offered freedom from the prison of fixed identity, who demonstrated that transformation was always possible, though never without cost, who insisted that the wild and ecstatic had their place alongside the ordered and rational. He was dangerous precisely because he was liberating, terrifying because he was joyful, destructive because he was creative. The Maenads who danced in his name, who tore apart animals and experienced states of consciousness that transcended everything their ordinary lives contained, were not victims of the god, but his willing partners in a project that challenged every assumption their society held about proper behavior, especially for women. The satyrs who represented unrestrained appetite, the thyrsus wielding initiates, the actors wearing masks, all of them were engaged in the same fundamental work, the same exploration of what it meant to be human when the boundaries that defined humanity were temporarily suspended. Dionysus had created a cult that was simultaneously a religion, a therapeutic practice, an art form, and a social revolution. The twice-born god who had survived death before birth, who had been driven mad by Hera and purified by Cybele, who had conquered Asia through wine and dance, had given humanity a gift that was also a challenge: the possibility of transcendence, the promise of direct divine experience, the offer of liberation from the constraints that kept consciousness safely contained within its ordinary boundaries. But, as every story of Dionysian worship demonstrated, from the mountains of Boeotia to the theatres of Athens, to the secret mystery cults scattered across the Mediterranean, accepting that gift required courage that bordered on recklessness, required willingness to risk madness for a chance at ecstasy, required understanding that transformation always came at a price. The god of wine and wildness, of theatre and ecstatic dance, of mystic vision and terrifying frenzy, he offered everything and demanded everything in return, and those who chose to follow him did so, knowing that they were stepping outside the safety of ordinary existence into a realm where the divine and the dangerous were impossibly, inextricably intertwined. Debut. When Dionysus finally turned his attention back to Greece after years of wandering through Asia, demonstrating his divinity to distant lands and gathering followers whose worship had transformed them into something both more and less than they had been, he carried with him not just the accumulated evidence of his power, but a specific purpose, a homecoming that was also a reckoning. He had proven himself everywhere except in the one place that mattered most: Thebes, the city where his mother Semele had been burned alive by Zeus's lightning, where his own divinity had been questioned before he even drew breath, where his aunts had claimed their sister was a liar and their nephew was no god but a bastard whose father was some mortal man Semele had taken to her bed. The insult had festered across the years, growing more intolerable with each triumph Dionysus achieved elsewhere. Kings across Asia had bowed to him, Entire populations had accepted wine and transformation, but in Thebes, in his own birthplace, among his own blood, the denial persisted. His aunts, Agave, Ino, and Autono, daughters of Cadmus who had founded the city, continued to spread the lie that Semele had invented the story of Zeus's paternity to cover her shame, that she had died not in divine fire but in punishment for her blasphemy. And now Agave's son Pentheus sat on the throne of Thebes, a young king barely out of adolescence, inheriting his mother's skepticism and his family's refusal to acknowledge what was obvious to the rest of the world, that Dionysus was a god, that he deserved recognition, that denying him carried consequences. So Dionysus returned, but not in the triumphal chariot pulled by panthers, not with the full divine regalia that might have announced his power unambiguously. Instead, he came disguised as his own high priest, a beautiful young man from Lydia with long hair and soft features, leading a contingent of Asian Maenads, whose ecstatic devotion to the strange god they followed made them both fascinating and terrifying to the citizens of Thebes. He arrived proclaiming that Dionysus, son of Zeus and Semele, demanded worship in the city of his birth, and if that worship was not freely given, then it would be extracted by force, by madness, by whatever method the god deemed necessary. The response was immediate and divided. Cadmus, the ancient founder of the city and grandfather to both Dionysus and Pentheus, recognized the danger immediately. He had lived long enough to understand that gods, real or imagined, required acknowledgement, that the smart play was always to err on the side of belief rather than skepticism. Together with Tiresias, the blind prophet who saw more than any sighted man, Cadmus dressed himself in the fawn skin of a Dionysian celebrant, took up the Thysus, and prepared to dance in the mountains despite his advanced age. It was pragmatic piety, the wisdom of men who understood that truth mattered less than consequences, that whether Dionysus was truly divine or simply a very powerful fraud, the result of refusing him would be catastrophic. But Pentheus, young and certain in the way only youth can be certain, saw only threat where his grandfather saw divine necessity. He looked at the Maenads dancing on Mount Cithaeron, at the women of Thebes who had abandoned their looms and their children to join in ecstatic worship, and he saw not religious ecstasy, but social breakdown, not divine possession, but dangerous delusion that would destroy the order he was trying to maintain. The king looked at his grandfather dressed in festival garb, preparing to cavort in the mountains like some common worshipper, and felt only shame and disgust. For me, what makes Pentheus both sympathetic and doomed is how completely reasonable his position initially appears. He wasn't wrong that Dionysian worship threatened civic order, that women abandoning their domestic roles to dance in mountains posed genuine problems for a society structured around their confinement and domestication. He wasn't wrong that this stranger from Asia with his soft appearance and his promise of ecstasy carried with him something genuinely dangerous, something that could unravel the careful structures that kept civilization functioning. Pentheus was trying to be a good king, trying to protect his city from what looked like madness. He simply failed to understand that the madness was divine, and divine madness could not be contained by human authority, no matter how legitimate that authority might be. Dombra. When Dionysus and Pentheus finally confronted each other face to face, the god still disguised as mortal priest. The conversation that unfolded was a masterpiece of divine manipulation and human blindness. Pentheus questioned the stranger, demanding to know about these Dionysian mysteries, these rites that were apparently so important they justified abandoning family and duty. Dionysus answered in riddles, cryptic responses that tantalized without illuminating, offering just enough information to inflame Pentheus's curiosity while withholding the understanding that might have saved him. The king, growing increasingly frustrated with answers that seemed designed to mock him, ordered Dionysus imprisoned, bound him with chains and locked him in the royal stables, perhaps with an angry bull for company depending on which version you read. It was the kind of solution that works for mortal problems, the application of force and confinement to something that seemed dangerous and uncontrollable. But Dionysus was neither dangerous in ways that chains could contain, nor controllable by any human authority. Zeus, the god, broke free effortlessly. The chains fell away as if they were nothing. The stable doors opened at a gesture. And as a final demonstration of what Pentheus was actually dealing with, Dionysus brought down the palace itself, or at least made it seem that way, through divine manipulation of perception. Earthquake and flame consumed the building, though whether the destruction was real or illusion, the sources don't entirely agree. Either way, the message was clear. You cannot imprison what refuses to be bound. You cannot contain transformation by building walls around it. You cannot defeat a god by treating him like a common criminal. But Pentheus, rather than recognizing defeat and capitulating, doubled down on his resistance. He was preparing to march on Mount Cithron with armed soldiers, to forcibly break up the Dionysian worship and restore order through military violence if necessary. It was exactly the wrong response, the kind of escalation that would only prove his complete failure to understand what he was facing. And it was at this moment that Dionysus changed tactics. Rather than continuing to meet force with force, rather than simply driving Pentheus mad the way he had with Lycurgus and so many others who had opposed him, the god decided to do something far more interesting. He decided to seduce the young king into his own destruction, to make Pentheus complicit in the fate that awaited him. Psychological insight Dionysus demonstrated here is chilling in its precision. He recognized what Pentheus couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge about himself, that beneath the rigid rationality, beneath the authoritarian insistence on order and control, the young king was fascinated by exactly what he claimed to despise. Pentheus wanted to see the Maenads in their ecstatic state, wanted to witness the forbidden rites that supposedly took place on the mountain, wanted to know what happened when women surrendered completely to Dionysian possession. So Dionysus offered him a way to satisfy that curiosity. Disguise yourself as a woman, the god suggested, dress in the festival clothes of a Maenads, and go to the mountain to spy on the rites without being detected. It was a trap so obvious that it seems incredible. Pentheus fell for it. But that's exactly the nature of divine manipulation. Dionysus wasn't just suggesting a course of action, he was actively clouding the king's judgment, making resistance impossible while maintaining the illusion that Pentheus was choosing freely. Chime. The scene where Dionysus dresses Pentheus in women's clothing, adjusting the fawn skin and arranging the wig, fussing over the details like a concerned stylist, is simultaneously darkly comic and profoundly disturbing. Pentheus submitted to the transformation, letting the god costume him for his own execution, and as he did, his consciousness began to slip. He started seeing double, thinking he saw two suns in the sky, believing he possessed supernatural strength, perceiving horns growing from Dionysus's head as the divine disguise started to crack and reveal what lay beneath. The king was already mad, already lost, before he ever set foot on Mount Cithron. Dionysus had achieved what chains and walls and rational argument could never accomplish. He had broken through Pentheus's defenses, not from outside, but from within, had turned the king's own repressed curiosity and fascination into weapons against him. The hunter had become the hunted, though Pentheus didn't understand this until it was far too late. When they reached the mountain, Dionysus performed one final act of staged cruelty. He used divine power to bend a massive evergreen tree down to the ground and placed Pentheus in its highest branches so the king could have a better view of the Maenads below. Then, as the tree snapped back upright with Pentheus trapped in its top, Dionysus revealed himself in all his divine glory and called out to his followers, pointing to the man in the tree, declaring that here was the spy who had come to mock their sacred rites. The Maenads, driven into immediate frenzy by the god's command, descended on the tree like a natural disaster made flesh. Led by Agave, Pentheus's own mother, still deep in the grip of divine possession, they tore the tree from the ground and dragged Pentheus down from the heights. What followed was the sparagmos, the ritual tearing apart that was central to Dionysian worship, but this time performed on a human victim rather than an animal. Tal. In their god-maddened state, the Maenads didn't see Pentheus, didn't recognize the young king, the son, the cousin, the ruler they had once acknowledged. Dionysus had clouded their perception so completely that they saw only a wild beast, a lion or boar, that needed to be destroyed as an offering to the god they worshipped. Agave struck first, driving her thyrsus into her son's body like a spear, and then the entire group descended, tearing him apart with their bare hands in a frenzy of devotion and divine madness. When it was over, Agave took Pentheus's severed head, impaled it on her thyrsus, and carried it back to Thebes as a trophy, still believing in her ecstatic delirium that she had killed a mountain lion, that she had performed some great service to Dionysus. She burst into the city, proclaiming her victory, calling for her father Cadmus to see what she had accomplished, displaying the head proudly to anyone who would look. The horror of what came next, of Cadmus and Tiresias gently, carefully bringing Agave back to sanity, forcing her to recognize that the lion's head she carried so proudly was actually her own son's, that she had murdered Pentheus with her own hands. This is where the tragedy becomes almost unbearable. Watching Agave's consciousness clear, seeing her realize what she has done, understanding that the god she worshipped has used her as an instrument of matricide and filicide simultaneously. There's no redemption in that recognition, only absolute devastation. Nysa appeared then in his true form, no longer disguised, and his words offered no comfort, no suggestion that the punishment had been anything but deserved. Pentheus had refused to recognize divinity, had attempted to suppress worship that was the god's due, and the consequence was this: the complete destruction of the royal house, the transformation of family bonds into instruments of murder, the demonstration that divine power could turn love itself into a weapon. Sixto Cadmus protested, argued that the punishment was excessive, that Pentheus's error came from youth and ignorance rather than malice. But Dionysus was unmoved. The insult to his mother had been standing for decades. The refusal to acknowledge his divinity had continued despite ample evidence, and mercy at this point would have suggested weakness rather than compassion. The royal house of Thebes would pay the full price, would serve as an example to anyone else who might consider denying the twice-born god his rightful place among the immortals. The victory at Thebes, brutal as it was, accomplished something essential. It proved beyond any possible doubt that Dionysus was divine, that his claim to be Zeus's son was legitimate, that his power rivaled and in some ways exceeded that of the established Olympians. Word spread across Greece of what had happened to Pentheus, of the terrible fate that befell those who refused Dionysian worship, and the resistance that had lingered in various city-states began to crumble. But recognition from mortals, however complete, was not the final goal. Dionysus wanted what had been denied him from birth: acceptance among the Olympians themselves, acknowledgement from the gods who had questioned his legitimacy, a seat at the table where divine power was distributed and cosmic decisions were made. He wanted, in short, to complete the journey that had begun in Zeus's thigh, to be twice born, not just physically, but socially, to claim the divine status that should have been his birthright. The path to Olympus was not through further violence or demonstration of power. Dionysus had proven his capacity for both well beyond any reasonable doubt. Instead, it required something more subtle, more political in the divine sense. He needed sponsorship, needed someone among the established gods to vouch for him, to argue for his inclusion in the pantheon. Some sources suggest it was Zeus himself who finally intervened, acknowledging his son and demanding that the other Olympians accept Dionysus among their number. Others claim that Dionysus earned his place through rescue and redemption, that he journeyed to the underworld to retrieve Semele, his mother who had died in Zeus's lightning, bringing her back from death and placing her among the immortals as Thyone. essentially resurrecting her and forcing the acknowledgement that if he could restore the dead to divine life, he certainly qualified for godhood himself. Either way, Dionysus achieved what had once seemed impossible. He took his place on Olympus, was granted a seat among the 12 principal gods, became part of the established divine order that had tried so hard to prevent his existence. It was a revolutionary achievement, the only instance in Greek mythology of a god who was born from a mortal woman ascending to full Olympian status, crossing a boundary that was supposed to be absolute. But his presence on Olympus changed things in ways that went beyond mere addition to the divine roster. Dionysus brought with him everything he represented: wine and wildness, ecstasy and madness, transformation and theatre. The relatively ordered pantheon that had existed before suddenly had to accommodate a god whose nature was fundamentally subversive, who challenged assumptions about control and rationality, who insisted that divine experience should be accessible to anyone willing to surrender to it. Wine became central to divine celebration. The ambrosia and nectar that had sustained the gods were joined by the substance Dionysus had discovered, and symposia on Olympus began to include the same mixture of philosophical discussion, artistic performance, and controlled intoxication that characterized their mortal equivalents. The distance between divine and human experience narrowed slightly, as Dionysus demonstrated that gods could descend into ecstatic states just as mortals could aspire to divine consciousness. His identification with theatre proved equally transformative. The dramatic festivals that had emerged from Dionysian ritual, particularly the tragic performances in Athens that drew thousands of citizens to witness mythological narratives performed by masked actors, became central to Greek culture in ways that shaped everything from political discourse to philosophical inquiry. Theatre was Dionysian worship made civic, ecstasy made safe enough for public consumption, transformation channeled into artistic expression that could challenge and change consciousness without requiring literal sparagmos. The Greeks came to understand tragedy specifically as Dionysian art performance, where actors wearing masks became vehicles for divine truth, where audiences experienced catharsis through witnessing terrible fates befall mythological heroes, where the boundary between representation and reality dissolved in ways that paralleled the boundary dissolution of Dionysian ritual. The theatre itself was sacred space, performances were religious festivals, and Dionysus presided over it all as the god who had revealed that transformation could be artistic as well as mystical, that ecstasy could be aesthetic as well as religious. Liberation became his final great gift and his most enduring legacy. Dionysus was the god who proved that fixed categories were more permeable than they appeared, that identity was not immutable, that the boundaries between self and other, between human and divine, between civilization and wildness, between control and surrender, all of these supposedly absolute divisions could be crossed, at least temporarily, by those willing to accept what he offered. Wine was the most accessible vehicle for this liberation, but it was never merely about intoxication. The ecstatic rites, the theatrical performances, the mystery cults that promised transformation extending beyond death itself. All of these were expressions of the same fundamental principle that Dionysus embodied, the understanding that human consciousness was not fixed, that experience could be radically altered, that existence contained possibilities far beyond what ordinary waking awareness revealed. His triumph on Olympus was therefore not just personal vindication for the god who had been twice born and thrice persecuted. It was the institutionalization of transformation itself, the acknowledgement at the highest level of divine authority that wildness and ecstasy and boundary dissolution were not threats to be suppressed, but necessary dimensions of existence that required their own divine patron. Dionysus had forced the gods themselves to acknowledge what civilization spent centuries trying to deny, that order alone was insufficient, that rationality needed to be balanced by ecstasy, that control had to make room for surrender if existence was to contain its full spectrum of possibility. The twice-born god took his place among the immortals, carrying with him the vine and the thyrsus, the mask and the wine cup, the promise of liberation and the threat of madness. All the paradoxes and contradictions that made him simultaneously the most beloved and most feared of the Olympians. He had conquered Asia, punished those who refused him, proven his divinity through demonstrations of power that still echo through mythology and literature, and finally claimed the recognition that had been denied him from before his first birth. But, even seated among the gods, even acknowledged as Zeus's legitimate son and Hera's unwilling stepson, Dionysus remained fundamentally other. The god who didn't quite fit, whose nature challenged the assumptions of divine civilization just as thoroughly as he challenged mortal conventions. He was the outsider who became an insider while maintaining his outsider perspective, the wild god who joined the divine establishment without being tamed by it. The twice-born who would spend eternity reminding both gods and mortals that transformation was always possible, always available, always dangerous, and absolutely necessary for existence to contain anything more than mere survival. The triumph was complete, but the revolution it represented would continue reverberating through human consciousness for millennia, long after the temples closed and the ancient rites were forgotten. Because what Dionysus had revealed, that ecstasy was sacred, that wildness was divine, that liberation could be achieved through surrender. These truths were too fundamental to be entirely suppressed, too deeply embedded in human experience to disappear even when the god who embodied them was reduced to stories and distant cultural memory. Number Nysus.